The rustic wedding is shattered as Mr. Juan slams a black dossier onto the altar. "Sign this and renounce all inheritance, or this marriage ends now," he growls. James instantly shields a sobbing Diep, his eyes burning with defiance. "Keep your money, father. I've already chosen her." Diep stands paralyzed, her white veil trembling with every choked sob as her dream turns into a nightmare. But to understand how this joy became a tragedy, let's go back 7 days ago. Golden sunlight spilled like honey across the old wooden courtyard, warming every worn plank and rusted nail. James looked nothing like the powerful businessman people used to fear. There was no tailored suit, no polished shoes, no guarded expression. He stood in a faded white shirt streaked with dust, sleeves rolled up, sweat shining on his brow as he carefully hammered wooden slats into place. Piece by piece, he was building their wedding arch with his own hands. A few steps away, Diep sat by the window where the light was best, bent over the simple wedding dress she had sewn herself. It was rustic, modest, and far from luxurious, but every stitch carried her heart. She was embroidering tiny roses along the sleeves, her fingers moving slowly, carefully, as if she were sewing their future into the fabric. Nearby, little Nee darted around the yard, laughing so brightly that her voice blended with the crackle of the fire under a giant pot where cake batter was beginning to thicken. For a moment, the whole world felt small, warm, and complete. James set down his hammer and walked over to Diep. His hands were rough now, no longer softened by office life. They were marked by days of hard work, splinters, soil, and sun. He reached out gently and wiped a smudge of ink from her forehead with his thumb. Diep looked up at him, surprised, then smiled. James smiled back, his voice low and soft. "As long as you're here, even this broken-down place feels like a palace." Diep lowered her eyes, trying to hide how deeply those words touched her. Everything around them was simple. The roof still leaked in heavy rain. The walls carried the stains of age. Their tools were borrowed. Their budget was almost nothing. But in that courtyard, surrounded by wood shavings, half-stitched cloth, and the smell of smoke and fresh fruit, healing lived in every breath. It felt as though the countryside had washed James clean of everything false. And for the first time in a long time, he seemed at peace. But peace never stays long when pride and power are involved. That same afternoon, the fragile calm shattered when Mr. Hone arrived. He didn't greet anyone. He didn't sit. He didn't even look at the wedding arch James had built with such care. He stepped into the courtyard like a storm front, his face cold and unreadable, then threw down the news like a blade. The 5 tons of wild pomelos from the farm had all been canceled. Every trader who had promised to take the fruit had backed out at the last minute. Not because of bad timing, not because of quality, because of pressure. His pressure. The courtyard fell silent. Even little Nee stopped running. Diep stared at him, the color draining from her face. "What do you mean canceled?" Mr. Hone's eyes shifted to the stacked pomelos sitting in baskets and under tarps, already beginning to soften under the punishing heat. "Exactly what I said. No one will buy them." James stepped forward, jaw tightening. "You did this?" Mr. Hone didn't deny it. "If you can't clear the stock in 3 days and fund your own wedding, then you are not worthy of entering my family." The words landed like a hammer blow. Diep turned toward the fruit, horror rising in her chest. 5 tons, not a few baskets, not a minor loss. This was everything the farm had counted on. Under the blazing weather, the pomelos were already beginning to decline. Another day or two, and much of it would be unsellable. James immediately thought of one solution. He still had private reserves, money he had kept outside the family's usual channels. He could step in, buy time, protect the farm, save the wedding, and keep Diep from carrying this burden alone. But before he could act, Mr. Juan revealed the final blow. Every account James could access had already been frozen. Not by accident, not by legal delay, by his own father. James looked at him in disbelief. "You froze my accounts?" Mr. Hahn's expression didn't change. "If you want to prove this marriage is worth fighting for, do it without my money." Diep looked from one man to the other, as if the ground beneath her feet had cracked open. Tomorrow had been supposed to be full of flowers, laughter, and vows. Instead, on the eve of their wedding, They stood with nothing. No cash, no buyers, no backup. Just mountains of fruit rotting in the heat and a deadline designed to break them. That night, sleep never came. The air inside the farmhouse was thick and restless. Diep sat at the wooden table, surrounded by peeled pomelo rinds, knives, sugar jars, and scraps of paper filled with rushed calculations. If no one would buy the fruit fresh, maybe they could process it. Maybe they could turn loss into something sellable. Hour after hour, she tested ideas. Then sometime deep into the night, her eyes lit up. Pomelo jam. Not ordinary jam, but dried pomelo jam. Sweet, fragrant, chewy, something that could last longer, be packaged quickly, and sold in smaller portions. She worked through the exhaustion, hands sticky with syrup, hair falling loose around her face. The first batch wasn't perfect, the second was better. By dawn, she finally held a finished piece between trembling fingers. James tasted it and looked at her in amazement. "This could work," he said. For the first time since Mr. Hohen's ultimatum, hope flickered. It was small, fragile, exhausted, but real. They spent the next day moving fast. Villagers who cared about Diep began helping. Some sliced fruit, some stirred syrup, others cleaned jars and cleared a section of the warehouse to store the first finished batches. The place smelled of citrus, smoke, and determination. Diep moved non-stop, barely pausing to drink water. James handled the lifting, the stacking, the fires, the transport. No one spoke much about the wedding anymore, but it was still there between them, in every hurried movement, in every promise left unspoken. By evening, the warehouse held the first real evidence that they might survive this. And that was exactly when disaster struck. A fire exploded from the backside of the warehouse. At first, it was only shouting, then sparks, then a wall of orange light tearing through the darkness. Someone screamed that the flames had started too fast, too suddenly. It didn't look natural. It didn't smell right. Later, people would whisper that John's men had been seen nearby. But in that moment, there was no time for suspicion, only panic. The heat surged outward. Smoke swallowed the air. Inside that burning warehouse sat not just fruit and supplies, but the last hope Diep had created with her own hands. And before anyone could stop him, James ran straight into the fire. The warehouse went up in flames so fast it felt planned. Fire tore through the wooden walls, swallowing baskets, trays, and everything they had worked all night to save. Villagers shouted for James to stay back, but he ignored them. With a wet cloth over his mouth, he ran straight into the smoke. Inside that burning building was Diep's last hope, and he refused to let it disappear without a fight. Diep tried to run after him, but people held her back. She screamed his name, staring at the doorway as sparks exploded into the night. Inside, James pushed through heat and smoke, trying to drag out whatever pomelo jam he could save. He managed to shove a few trays toward the exit. Then came a terrible crack. A heavy beam collapsed from above and slammed down on him before he could escape. The villagers rushed in, fighting the fire and pulling debris away with bare hands. By the time they dragged James out, he was unconscious. Diep rode with him to the hospital, clutching his hand the whole way, whispering through tears, begging him not to leave her. When the ER doors closed, she was left alone under the cold hospital lights, covered in ash and smoke. Then Mr. Hahn appeared. He walked toward her in his dark suit, untouched by the chaos, his face as cold as ever. He looked through the glass at James, then turned to Diep and gripped her shoulders. "Because of you," he said, "he lost everything, and now he may never walk again." Diep froze. Mr. Hahn pulled out a set of divorce papers and forced them into her hands. "If you still have any conscience," he said, "sign these and disappear. I'll take him abroad for treatment. That's the only way he still has a future." Diep stared at the papers, shattered. Stay with him and risk ruining his life forever, or let him go so he might be saved. It was an impossible choice. Later, when she was finally allowed to see him, James lay unconscious in the hospital bed, surrounded by machines and bandages. Diep stood beside him, crying silently, her hand resting on his. She pulled the divorce papers from her bag, looked at them, then folded them and put them away. She would not sign. At dawn, Diep returned to the farm. The warehouse was blackened and half destroyed, but not everything was gone. Some pomelos had survived. A few batches of jam were still usable, and the villagers had not given up. She went from house to house asking for help. Women brought knives, jars, and stoves. Men cleared debris and rebuilt work tables. Young people brought phones, lights, and tripods. By noon, the courtyard had become a small production line. Then Diep went live. Standing in front of a phone camera with smoke-stained walls behind her, she looked straight into the lens. Her eyes were red, but her voice was steady. "I don't need the Hoan family's fortune," she said. "I need my man." The live stream spread quickly because it was raw and real. Orders poured in. Donations followed. Strangers sent messages of support. The villagers packed jars non-stop, calling out orders in sealing boxes late into the night. By the end of the day, they had raised enough money to cover James's treatment. Diep brought the money straight to the hospital. At the payment counter, she settled the bills. Mr. Hoan stood nearby and watched in stunned silence. Then Diep turned to him and held up the receipt. "This money is my sweat and tears, not yours," she said. "I will marry James, even if he has to sit in a wheelchair for the rest of his life." For once, Mr. Hoan said nothing. A few days later, the wedding was held in the hospital courtyard. There was no grand venue, no luxury decor, only soft morning light, a few flower strings, and the wooden arch the villagers had rebuilt from the one James had made. Nurses stood nearby, smiling. Villagers gathered quietly, many already in tears. James sat in a wheelchair, pale but awake. And when he saw Diep walking toward him in her handmade rustic dress, his eyes lit up. She was beautiful not because the dress was expensive, but because every stitch carried love, loss, and survival. From a distance, Mr. Hoan watched in silence. He looked at his son, then at Diep, then at the people surrounding them. At last, something in him softened. His eyes filled and he quietly wiped away a tear. Then he stepped forward. Without a word, he took James's hand and placed it into Diep's. As they exchanged rings, the truth became clear. Love is not about sharing glory when life is easy. It is about staying when everything falls apart. Real happiness comes when we dare to protect what matters most, no matter the cost. But even then, danger had not disappeared. In a dark corner of the hospital courtyard, John stood watching with a faint, unreadable smile. He flicked his cigarette to the ground and crushed it beneath his shoe. "The real game," he muttered, "has only just begun."
7 ngày trước khi căng thẳng ở lễ cưới, James và Diep đã phải trải qua chuỗi bi kịch tưởng chừng không thể vượt qua khi ông Hoàng phong tỏa toàn bộ tài sản và ép hủy hợp đồng tiêu thụ tấn bưởi của trang trại. Hai người rơi vào cảnh trắng tay ngay trước ngày cưới, không chịu khuất phục. Diep nghĩ ra cảnh làm nước quỷ để cứu vãn tình thế, cả làng cùng giúp đỡ. Nhưng một vụ hỏa hoạn bí ẩn thiêu rụi nhà kho và khiến James bị thương nặng. Trong bệnh viện, ông Hoàng ép Diep ký đơn ly hôn để cứu tương lai của con trai. Tuy nhiên, cô bị từ chối bỏ buộc kêu gọi cộng đồng livestream và gây quỹ thành công chữa trị cho James.